7 years ago, in 2012, Mohamed Morsi became Egypt's first democratically elected president. A member of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has since been outlawed, Morsi won 51% of the vote. His election followed the Arab Spring uprising, which saw the end of a 30-year rule under previous President Hosni Mubarak. Morsi promised to head a government for all Egyptians. But dissatisfaction quickly grew, prompting huge protests against him. Many were angry about the Muslim Brotherhood's influence on politics and believed Morsi had failed to deliver on his promises. After just 1 year in office, Morsi was ousted in a military takeover led by Egypt's current president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Morsi was immediately arrested and remained behind bars until his death. He was serving a life sentence related to the killing of protesters in 2012 demonstrations, and he was facing at least 6 other trials. His supporters say the charges against him were politically motivated and that he was being mistreated and denied medical treatment whilst in prison. The Muslim Brotherhood has blamed the Egyptian government for his death. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan paid tribute to Morsi while also condemning President al-Sisi.
May Allah rest our brother Morsi, our martyr's soul, in peace. As you know, the tyrant Sisi, who took power in Egypt by suppressing democracy through a coup, has so far executed nearly 50 Egyptians, and the West has remained silent.
Meanwhile, Egypt's chief prosecutor has released a statement saying medical experts will determine the cause of Morsi's death, seemingly so sudden in the courtroom on Monday.
Okay, with so many questions out there, let's go straight to Cairo and journalist Ruth Michelson. Good morning, Ruth. Thanks for joining us. Amnesty International is among those calling for an investigation into Morsi's death. What more do we know?
Well, as you mentioned, Amnesty International are calling for an investigation. They say that because former President Morsi was held for solitary confinement for almost 6 years, that breaches the standards of torture under international law, and that they say the Egyptian government is required to investigate the reasons why former President Morsi died. There was also a group of British MPs who formed something called the Detention Review Panel, which investigated the conditions under which former President Morsi was being kept. And they said that the lack of medical care and inadequate medical care for his liver disease and diabetes meant that he was at risk of premature death, which they declared in a report last year. And so, there are many groups that drew long-term attention to the conditions under which he was being held.
Okay, so a lot of questions out there, a lot of allegations. What's the Egyptian government saying about them and about how he died?
Well, as you mentioned, Egypt's public prosecutor said in a report that they would investigate. They also said that shortly before 5 p.m. Cairo time yesterday, former President Morsi was dead on arrival at a hospital in Cairo, and that he had died after fainting and collapsing in the courtroom. They said that they seized the cameras that were in the courtroom and that they will question those who were inside the defendant's cage with him, which implies that they are under scrutiny. And they also reportedly buried him in an unknown site to the east of Cairo early this morning, in an effort to prevent his grave from becoming a pilgrimage site for his supporters.
Okay, now the Muslim Brotherhood that Morsi once led is calling for protests. So what can we expect in Cairo in the days ahead?
Well, there is likely to be some outrage. It is, important to remember that this man was an extremely controversial figure. He was a symbol of democracy and freedom for some, a group that was long underground and then came to rule Egypt. But for others, he is seen as an enemy of the state and was seen as this right up until the time of his death, even though he was in prison. It's also important to remember the context that mass protests, especially by the Muslim Brotherhood, who are considered a terrorist organization in Egypt, that these mass protests have been essentially banned since a law in 2013. So while there's likely to be some anger among Morsi's supporters, it's also unlikely that we would see a mass democratic event like we saw in 2011 or 2012.
Ruth Michelson in Cairo for us. Thanks so very much.